Back in late February, we were looking for a place to go hiking that wasn't near a bunch of crowds. So we headed to southern Utah to Capitol Reef National Park, Utah's least visited national park. We rented a place in Teasdale, a short drive from the park, and set out for a week of day hikes. Our first hike took us across the park's eastern border and then south 20 miles or so down a dirt road to hike to Strike Valley Overlook, which we heard was a nice scenic lookout. They say not that many people come down this far south, but this time of year there's hardly anyone in the park anyway. The first part of the trail is a four-wheel drive road you could drive on, but we parked back at the two-wheel drive trailhead and walked. The rocks are pretty sharp in some places, and I didn't want to risk puncturing a tire this far from, well, anything. Eventually that road ends and the foot trail starts. This part's only about half a mile over sand and slick rock. And it's pretty easy hiking, almost completely flat. So before very long you reach the overlook. The views seem to go on forever, looking over Strike Valley with the Henry Mountains off in the distance. When we left Strike Valley, we decided not to backtrack and instead to take the Burr Trail Road west. There are some great views here, especially in Long Canyon, where a lot of car commercials are shot. After that, we headed north through Dixie National Forest, which took us up high enough that this was the coldest weather I've ever driven in. I know I'm from Florida, but still, this was pretty cold. The next day, we did a point-to-point hike, with our friends Noah and Jen helping us drop our car at the finish point. We started out on the Grand Wash Trail, which is a flat walk through a canyon. Sometimes it's narrow and sometimes it's super wide. Eventually we reached the turnoff for the Frying Pan Trail, which is also how you get up to Cassidy Arch. This is where Noah and Jen turned back and Michelle and I continued, and this is also where it stops being flat. Even though it's cold at the trailhead, if you're in the sun and exerting yourself, it can get pretty warm. We must have said to each other 100 times on this trip how we would not want to be here in the summer. People who want to hike to Cassidy Arch can drive to just about this point, so the trail gets more crowded around here. We turned onto the side trail to Cassidy Arch and went part of the way, but didn't go all the way to the arch. That wasn't what we came out here for anyway. Back on the Frying Pan Trail past Cassidy Arch, the crowds quickly disappeared, and we were once again the only people around. The trail has lots of opportunities to stop and enjoy a scenic view. There's a decent bit of elevation gain on this trail, but it's not always like climbing stairs. Sometimes it's just a gentle uphill. I really enjoyed this part of the trail. It felt like we had the entire park to ourselves. After a little over 8 miles, we reached Hickman Bridge trailhead, which is where we dropped our car earlier. The next day, we were right back at that trailhead to hike to Hickman Bridge. This is probably the most popular hiking destination in the whole park, and it's only about 1 mile each way, which isn't much distance for us. Still, we couldn't come all the way here and not see it. The trail does a loop around and under the bridge, so you can see it from every side. This is definitely worth seeing. It only took us about an hour to hike to the bridge and back. Since we had plenty of time, we headed south down the Scenic Drive, which lives up to its name, then a couple of miles down a dirt road to Capitol Gorge. There are some petroglyph panels here, but you have to look pretty close to find them. And there's also something called the Pioneer Register, which is really 100-year-old graffiti. All of these are a pretty easy and quick walk from the trailhead. By this point in the trip, we all wanted to hike a slot canyon, so we drove out to Cottonwood Wash on the east side of the park. We learned that you can't just drive up to a slot canyon. You have to hike something that narrows into a slot canyon, and there might be boulders in the way, or maybe a pool you even have to swim across. We'd read that there's a slot canyon if you follow this wash long enough, so we gave it a try. After a while, the wash narrowed a bit, and there were occasional rocks we had to climb over, but nothing too difficult. But eventually, we got to what seemed like a dead end. Unless you can climb up and out of the canyon here, this is it. So we gave up on this one and headed back to the car. Just a few miles down the road was Sheets Gulch, so we decided to give it another try. Much like before, you're walking along a road-sized path that slowly narrows, and then there are some rocks blocking the way that you need to navigate, but that's part of the fun. There's probably an official definition of what is a slot canyon, but we decided it meant you could touch both walls at the same time.
That's the slot.
Touch both walls at once in here, guys.
Our persistence paid off this time, and it was super fun walking through the really narrow slot canyon. The next day, we drove out to Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument to hike to Lower Calf Creek Falls. I'd driven on roads where one side of the road has a drop-off like a cliff, but never a road where both sides are like that. Thankfully, that part was just a mile or so. This trail, more than the others, felt like you're hiking in the desert. Maybe it's all the cactus. And if you know where to look, you can spot some pictographs left by the Fremont people who lived here around 1,000 years ago. Once again, we had this trail pretty much to ourselves, including the falls, where apparently there's a problem with pooping. It's about 3.5 miles one way to the falls and mostly in the sun, so I would not want to be out here on a hot day. The mornings were pretty cold, and the next day we even got some snow, which gave Jen the chance to recreate Toby, her vacation snowman. Then Michelle and I headed out to the Rim Overlook Trail. This starts like you're going to Hickman Bridge, but turns off before the bridge. And once again, we had this trail all to ourselves. There are views back towards the visitor center and campground that you can see as you're climbing. And where there's not a dirt path, the trail is clearly marked with cairns. And you can also see some faint yellow painted footsteps, which used to be how they marked the trail long ago. The view is even better from the Rim Overlook point. From here, you can even continue on a couple miles to Navajo Knobs, but this is as far as we went. While there was still snow on the ground, we drove back out to the Dixie National Forest and pulled off in a campground that was closed for the season to play in the snow. This probably seems silly, but we don't get a lot of chances to do this back in Florida. I even got to make my very first snowman ever. On our last day, we hiked the Chimney Rock Trail, which we had driven past every day on our way into the park. It's very close to the entrance. This trail is a loop that takes you up and around Chimney Rock for some nice views. All the climbing is at the start of the trail. Then you can take it easy and check out the views and the unusual geological features that are all over this park. This is a pretty quick trail, and you could even just hike a portion of it and get a lot of the views. It's right along the highway, so it's really easy to get to. After spending a week at Capitol Reef National Park, it felt like we had found a secret. I would definitely recommend visiting, and late February, early March felt like the perfect time to be here. For now, though, we're headed back home to Florida.